Hi, good morning. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us today at the American Enterprise Institute with Representative John Katko, where we're going to talk about cybersecurity, and I'm very excited about this discussion. To start this off, John Katko is a Republican representative from the 24th District of New York, and he serves as the ranking member on the House Homeland and Security Committee. But before joining Congress, he had a major role at the Department of Justice as the Assistant United States Attorney General, where he spent 20 years working on RICO cases, as well as he spent time at the Security and Exchange Commission as in the enforcement division, which I imagine is really being helpful right now as we're dealing with so much in ransomware and what's going on with with crypto and cybersecurity. So, Congressman, welcome. Thank you for spending your Friday morning with us to talk about cyber.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. And there's been a lot going on. You and I talked in January, but since then we've had a tremendous amount of activity in this area. I know that you spent 2 decades in organized crime as a prosecutor, as well as working, for the United States all around the world. And we've previously talked about the stuff you were able to do with the Mexico and South American situation. I feel like we're getting a little back into that in cyber in a way that we didn't expect to with all the ransomware work that's going on. But tell us how that your previous history in this is coloring the work that you're doing in Homeland Security.
Well, really, the parallels as to the structural parallels of how you attack the problem are really quite strikingly similar. Like I was a prosecutor in El Paso, Texas, on the border going after cartels. I was in Puerto Rico for a couple of years doing cartel work and death penalty cases, and have really worked all over the world. Been at dozens of embassies going after bad people and everything else. So, one thing I learned in that job is that you have to work in a collaborative manner with federal, state, local, and international law enforcement. And the same thing holds true in Homeland Security. And really, this whole task force concept of getting everybody under the same roof, one roof, and working together and putting aside their differences and their turfs is critically important. It was what caused a problem with Homeland back 20 years ago when 9/11 happened. That the stovepipes created the lack of information sharing. And right now, we have to work with federal, state, local, international law enforcement, but we also have to work with the private sector and in a collaborative manner to make sure that we're attacking people as much as we can. Now, the other thing that held true back then, and holds true now is the bad guys don't take you serious unless you whack the hell out of them. And so when I got someone and I was prosecuting them, I went after it, and they, after a while, they understood that there was a deterrent effect and there was a credibility threat that if I said I was going to do something, I was going to do it. We as a country need to be doing that as well. And I'm sure we'll be talking about that today.
I know you have 5 pillars that you introduced this winter, and I believe whacking the hell out of it was number 5. Do I have that right?
Very good. You did your homework.
Following along. It's very important. So you have called cybersecurity the preeminent threat to our national security. So before we dive into some of these specifics, can you talk about your approach to cybersecurity and this particular Congress as we're seeing it is becoming more of a top priority?
I tell you what, it's remarkable how much things have changed in the Homeland Security realm in the 7 years or so, or 6.5 years or so I've been in Congress. When I first got here, ISIS was all anyone was thinking about, and Americans have very short memories. But my gosh, we had a lot of ISIS-inspired attacks in this country that were horrific and violent, and one-time high-profile, high-violent attacks. ISIS is now rendered to a much lower level of threat for the United States, and international terrorism is still an issue. But the new terrorism, the new threat, and the new preeminent threat is really cybersecurity. I mean, the ransomware attacks we have and everything else that's going on. We've Hafnium, SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, the recent beef attack on our beef infrastructure. They admitted to paying $11 million in ransomware. It's going to continue to escalate, and the critical infrastructure is a real problem. So because of that, we looked at things. We did our 5 pillars, and I'm just going to buzz through them real quick to remind everybody. Rethinking our fragmented approach to the .gov security by consolidating security with CISA. CISA has to be the quarterback of the .gov domain. We have to have them working with the private sector as well. Developing an understanding of the nature and extent of third-party risk. That's Hafnium, that's SolarWinds in particular. Actually reducing the risk through certification regimes instead of just creating these perfunctory compliance exercises. certification regimes that have some teeth, that have some substance to them is going to be really important. Drive better software assurance and development process across the system. And finally, imposing real costs on the cyber adversaries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I mean, think about Russia. We know that the group that hacked into Colonial Pipeline was from Russia. It's absolutely inconceivable that they were a rogue operation in Russia. There's no way that the Russian government didn't know that they exist and what they were up to. And if we don't have and convey strong responses, then there's no deterrence. And I think the president has a real opportunity this weekend to start to set the table with that and let them know, hey, we have offensive cyber capabilities, and tell them we're going to use them if you keep this crap up. And I think that we have to do that, and we have to go after them and have proportionate or maybe even disproportionate responses to deter them from doing that in the future.
I think it was about a week ago, the Department of Justice announced that they are going to start treating ransomware like terrorism attacks. So I'm not sure that the average American understands that there was a difference. It certainly seems like a promising point that the government is going to start looking at these as terrorist attacks and not just something that the private sector has to deal with.
Well, let's really think about it. Until Colonial Pipeline, what was the real visual result of cyber attacks? I mean, they were for companies that were economic based, but this Colonial Pipeline changed a lot, and the beef attack too, because it affected supply. And all of a sudden, there's lines at gas stations. All of a sudden, people are inconvenienced. All of a sudden, they can't do what they want to do. And all of a sudden, like, hey, wait a minute. They may not see the violence component that ISIS was that was the ISIS trademark, but they do see the disruption. And once that starts, people start getting it. But we have to get it as a country. I mean, I look at everybody's home. I look around my home right here, and I'm looking at probably 10 devices that are attached to the internet right in front of my eyes. And we have so many vulnerabilities. And if we don't learn to have better cyber hygiene on all levels, at our homes, at our businesses, and our government, we're going to be in for a rough sledding. There's no question that this is the preeminent threat.
Yeah, I've been in the tech space for a long time, and I always said plug and play is a bit of our own challenge. We've made it very easy.
Yes, it is.
Great. So then, when I go to see my relatives, the first thing everybody knows to do is they have to put their device out, and I won't talk to them until they let me update their software. Like, there's a reason for updating your software. We found a couple bugs along the way. Going back to this current administration, you have had some concerns about the Biden budget on CISA. They didn't up the number. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this administration, and look, I'm the most bipartisan member in all of Congress, literally rated that. And and I pride myself on being as non-political as possible, but it just doesn't seem like the rhetoric, the actions are matching the rhetoric. He says he wants to be bipartisan, and then he has these very partisan bills. He says he wants to have cybersecurity and beef up CISA. And then you see their budget, which is this gigantically bloated $6 trillion monstrosity. There's no plus up in spending for CISA. CISA guy has to be the quarterback of the .gov domain, like I said, and the .mil domain is a Department of Defense, and we have the Intel community. All three of those things, they're like, offense, defense, and special teams, right? And then you have the National Cyber Director that we're just getting online. But if you cannot have a second-rate CISA. CISA needs to be on its way to a $5 billion agency, and they didn't even plus it up to spending in CISA. Yet they bloated the budget by $2 trillion. So obviously the priority is not where they're saying it is, and we need to really make some noise with that to make sure that we get that where it needs to be.
Actual attacks on the government systems have been widely publicized and a big challenge over the last couple of years. Do you see that we're having more cross-functional information sharing within the government?
Yes, it's better, but nowhere near enough. And I go back to when I was a prosecutor, I'll tell you. When I was a prosecutor, I had federal, state, local, and sometimes international law enforcement co-located, right? And under one roof. And you naturally shared information. The outgrowth of what happened in 9/11 was JTTFs all across this great country, Joint Terrorism Task Forces. They have stopped incalculable amounts of terror attacks in this country and kept us much safer. That same concept needs to be grafted into the cyber community, and it's in its infancy. And we have some things that are very difficult. I mean, we have to have more information sharing. We have to have compliance issues where there's already some requirements. We need more, where when you have an incident, it's reported and it's reported in a manner that doesn't cause liability for the company. You can strip out the identifiers, give them the malware component, give it to CISA, give it to whomever, so that we can then understand better the whole landscape of the cyber threat attacks. And if we're not doing that, and we're not right now, I mean, I think CISA gets less than 1% of the information on attacks. How the hell can they be as effective as they have to be, right? So there has to be more information sharing, and there has to be a systematizing of that, or it's not going to get anywhere.
I think we're all trying to find a positive path forward, and one of the things that was in the President Biden's executive order is establishing a cybersecurity safety review board that has been compared to the National Transportation Safety Board, which reviews all the civil transportation accidents and investigations. Part of me says it's very, you always want to have a post-mortem when you can, as quickly as possible, so you can find out. But it's gotten mixed reviews, if it's actually feasible. And then it goes also to the question you have with liability. Are people willing, because most of this is going to happen in private corporations, are they willing to let government entities come in and, see what's going on? And then are we having the ability to share that, not only within that corporation and with the government, but also possibly within the industry and cross-functionally and in some of the critical mission industries?
Yeah, I mean, that's the rub. The rub is, how do you incentivize the private sector to tell you something that's really bad that happened to their company without them incurring liability? So what happens? Just think it to its logical conclusion. What happens if the company files all the information and does everything they're supposed to do, and is properly insulated all private sector information from, like, let's say it was a bank that was hacked, right? And they just get the malware in, so there's nobody's private information is exposed. Great. But what happens if all of a sudden shareholders look at that bank and say, you know what? We see you got attacked. We see there was a cyber attack. I also see that your CEO doesn't know who the hell your intel officer is, or your chief information officer is. And I also see that you guys weren't up to the state-of-the-art standards as far as cybersecurity goes. And quite frankly, about 98% of the companies probably are there. So I'm shocked there's not more lawsuits going forward already. So we've got to iron all that stuff out. I don't think you can make companies immune from their own negligence, but we've got to figure out a way, and it's going to be difficult, and we've been talking about this for years, to get that information so that we can better go after the bad guys. Because that's exactly what's happening in the terrorism realm with the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, and it's working unbelievably well. And we've got to do the same on this side. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do know that if we don't do it, we're going to have a heck of a lot more of the attacks than we just had. Because I really do think that you look at Colonial Pipeline, you look at all the others, it's almost like they're ratcheting up. They're kind of probing, thrusting and parrying. Where are the real weaknesses? Where can we really get these guys? And obviously, it's critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure, we can talk more about. That's where the rubber hits the road. And I think the bad guys have figured that out. And I think the bad actors, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea know that as well. And it's just a matter of time before we have a catastrophic attack if we don't start sharing information in a better manner.
Yeah, we saw that back in 2014-15 when JP Morgan was hacked. That actually, I did an event over at the Middle East Institute, and the gentleman who was the former undersecretary really early on at DHS mentioned that there was a group of bad actors who had figured out actually the regulatory friction we had between the banks and how we don't share information at a government, that it was basically through the financial industries, ISAC, that they were managing that. But they when they got attacked, they also couldn't call in the cavalry, let's say, some sort of government entity to say, we've got to stop the hemorrhaging here, but we also need to notify and let other people know that this is the current way that the attack's going. So, I mean, I'm hopeful that in 10 years we've learned more about that, but I feel like we keep watching this lesson over and over again, but not learning from it.
There's no question about it.
Yeah, you're going back to your SEC days, I guess, and I'm not a big regulation person unless I feel like we've kind of been pushed into a corner, and I feel like we have sort of been pushed into a corner on this one. That it used to be that boards didn't pay attention to certain things about compensation or things that were going on in the HR level, and now are we getting boards to the point where they're corporate boards that they need to be like, I actually do need to know who the CISO is, the Chief Information Security Officer, and know what our programs and protocols are.
Yeah, there's been a lot of chatter about, are you going to require it? Number one, require corporations to do this, and that's open to discussion. But I do think, at a minimum, And hey, I'm looking at this strictly. My staff's probably gonna have a stroke when I say this, but in the 10Ks and the 10Q annual and the quarterly reports of publicly held companies, maybe there needs to be some certification language where they say they certify that they're using state-of-the-art standards in cybersecurity and establish what those standards are. At a minimum, doing that, because then if you find out they don't, then of course there's liability. And I use similar language with a company once that said in their 10Q, yeah, everything's great, we're doing great, everything's awesome. 6 weeks later, they filed for bankruptcy. So of course, I went back and took that language and said, well, what the hell is this? And we held them accountable. So
Right.
something similar to that, and it's simply if you can get them to certify that they're adhering to the best practices or best standards, and you find out they're not, then that's an awful lot of incentive right there, and that will breed an awful lot of cooperation right there because they don't want to have that liability. So that's just a thought.
I actually think the 10Ks are some of the best reading come first quarter when you see really creative lawyering. Google always mentions that there's the potential for a hurricane or an earthquake that could, damage their servers. And it's like paragraphs and paragraphs of this could be horrible. And you're like, wow, that's a bad place to live. Let's hope none of that happens. But they admit it. They know that there's real problems out there and hopefully there's
Yeah, right.
well, yeah.
Right.
Joseph Marks in the Washington Post posted an article about 2 hours ago talking about the need possibly for government mandates on basic cybersecurity. And you touched on this just a little bit in your entry remarks. Who do you think are the people that are going to be our basic cybersecurity baseline people? Is that different by industry, or because it is kind of information technology, do you see one group that could coordinate that?
Group as far as a government
Well,
agency
so,
or
yeah, the idea of like
private
we have
entity?
the basic cybersecurity is always challenged because what's basic to one industry is different to another. But when you're talking about just protecting servers and the information on the servers, these are the systems that are running our economy, both the data and the actual network operations. So, kind of
Well, I
who
think
gets
I think you got to look at like what we're trying to do in the critical infrastructure sector to start with, right? That is obviously something that it's a relatively finite group of individual of companies. Uh, the critical infrastructure sector, and I've have some legislation addressing this issue to try and beef up standards within the critical infrastructure community. But I think if you can go sector by sector to some extent, financial institutions kind of have more unique issues than the critical infrastructure. Financial institutions are subject of cyber attacks several times a second, probably, or several times a minute at a minimum. So they have issues that are more unique than perhaps the critical infrastructure sector, where if there is an attack, it's catastrophic. Not from a financial standpoint, from an actual safety standpoint, obviously electrical grids and the pipelines and all that. That may be a little bit different. Look at the hospital sectors; they're the subject of ransomware attacks because they got to keep their people healthy. So there are all these different sectors, and I think there can be some subsectoring, if you will, if that's a word. But I think taking critical infrastructure as an example, it's a real problem right now. It's a finite area. We should do that. We do, like I went going back to pillars. You got to have some sort of standards that mean something. We have to have certification regimes that actually are real and that have some teeth, but have some clarity to them. And I think there's so much out there for people trying to simplify, but also trying to understand. There's some sector specific things like the critical infrastructure is really important. So I'm hoping it makes sense, but I think it's. New York City treats terrorism differently than Syracuse, New York, for example, because New York City terrorism they're the number one target. Up in upstate New York, we're more worried about our water supply and the power grid because that's our vulnerabilities up here. But down there, it's the bombastic, fantastic terrorism issue. Airline industry is another whole thing, which I've spent a lot of time on trying to keep safe. And so TSA plays a critical role. So I think you have to look at industry by industry.
Yep. You also tapped on the idea of supply chain management when we look at Colonial finally gave they gave people a physical entity to understand the problem. And we this situation with chips and the our semiconductors are fascinating because not only are we seeing an immediate situation with that with like let's say the auto manufacturers, but the long tail is a little frightening. They think where we are and where we are beholden to the certain entities on that. I know the Senate just passed. I don't know if they're still calling it the Endless Frontiers Act. That's what I think about it is, or the portion of that. How is that going to play out in the House? Do you want to do a little predictive legislative thought for us?
Oh yeah, yeah. If we don't pass it, then we're never going to pass any legislation. I'll tell you much. So to back up, just set the table a little bit.
This
I walked into a Lincoln. I walked into a Lincoln dealership the other day just for the hell of it, and I went to two different ones. Neither one of them had any cars, and they're not going to have any cars for several weeks because because of a chip shortage. That's pretty amazing in Syracuse, New York, right? And so then you start taking a step back and think about this chip issue overall. Taiwan manufactures about 80% of the high-end chip manufacturing in the world. And if China decides to continue to rattle the saber and do something to disrupt that supply chain, either by going into Taiwan or something, what's going to happen to the world supply? And what I think this whole pandemic taught us is, yes, it's a global economy. Yes, you can rely on foreign people to supply you, but you cannot do it to your detriment. And you have to look for that rainy day issue. And that's what's coming out of the Senate. It's a $52 billion fund for domestic chip manufacturing, and it's past time to get it done. So I'm highly confident that something will get done in the House, because I think it'll fly in the House because, first of all, nothing ever gets done in the Senate. And so when they got something come out of the Senate that's this substantial and this significant, I think that means something. And I think that we can get it, it's going to fly through the House and the better. And I must say, like, upstate New York, we have unlimited supplies of water, and that's a key component of chip manufacturing. So places like upstate New York can be real beneficiaries. So I'm hopeful for it in that respect. But make no mistake about it, that is a very serious threat. Air conditioners, TVs, refrigerators, everything has chips, and everything is going to be disrupted if we don't start becoming better with the supply chain risks. And supply chain risks in chip manufacturing are a microcosm of everything else, 5G technology and the whole Huawei issue and all the other things we have. And that's like, I'm not saying like bring everything back home and the hell with the world, but we've got to recognize that there are vulnerabilities, and there are, China not only wants to make money off of us, they want to spy on us all they can, and they want to be able to disrupt us all they can. And if we don't understand the supply chain risks involved and bring some of that back home, we have real problems. So I'm confident that the bill coming out of the Senate is gonna do well in the House. I'll be very surprised if it isn't. Shame on us if it doesn't.
I'm glad to hear that. You're always amazed, even like in our own little worlds, but when something happens and like I can't get to my cloud, or I never let the battery go down on my phone. People get under 30%. I like hyperventilate for them. I'm like, how do you not have your phone plugged in? That's gonna be horrifying.
Good for you.
We're going to go to Q&A, and I apologize because I'm going to read these live, so I haven't seen these. So let's hope that, Will, you're vetting these so these make sense. It says President Biden is meeting with Putin next week and planning on discussing the cost Russians will face if they continue to harbor cyber criminals. We are the world's greatest offensive cyber threat, but we are also arguably the most vulnerable. Can we criticize Biden's executive order, but at the same time understand now that there are we now have 3 administrations who haven't been able to come up with policies that would hurt cyber perpetrators and impose real costs on the Chinese and the Russian officials. Representative Katko, I'm asking if specific changes can be made to U.S. cyber policy. Would you recommend it be placed not only on Biden but on Trump and Obama? I don't think we have to worry about the past. I think
but absolutely. But I will tell you this: he points up a really good thing. We haven't done a good job with proportional responses. And because of that, I think we've laid bare our systems, and they're not really afraid. It's kind of like before I started the gang task force in Syracuse, gangs were out of control, and you couldn't walk from one neighborhood to the next without getting shot in the city because of they carved up the neighborhoods. So we did the gang task force and started whacking them, and all of a sudden murder rate dropped 40% and violent crime dropped exponentially. And it's because of the fear factor, knowing you do this, we're going to come get you. And we took out a bunch of gangs, right? And the crime rate plummeted. It's the same concept. If we don't have a proportional or disproportionate response, and I think previous presidents are guilty of it as well. I don't think they fully appreciated the threat that that's in the cyber realm, and I don't think they fully appreciated China. China's got a 100-year plan. They got a 50-year plan. They want to dominate the world, and I think. Going into them and trying to work diplomacy they don't understand it. Bad guys only understand strength and power. If I walked into a guy and I said, hey, we got some pretty good stuff on you, so you should plead guilty and cooperate against all your buddies, the guy'd be like, screw you. But went in and said, here's the evidence I have, laid it all out, and if you don't do it, you're going to die in prison. You want to cooperate, or do you want to die in prison? That's the type of strength we need to project. And that's what we're not doing now. And that's why I think, like I said, raising CISA's profile to keep it on an even keel with DOD and with the intel community, and then have the head coach, if you will, being in this National Cyber Command director, who can look at all that defensive and offensive capabilities, properly advise a president, when we should, what we should do, when we should do it, but also making sure that the president understands that cybersecurity is our preeminent threat, and if we don't fight back, this is like a new arms race in the world, in my mind. And it's a new nuclear arms race, right? This is a new Cold War. And if we don't elevate it to that and understand that is the threat, we are sadly mistaken. And so when you go to see guys like Putin, he sizes you up, and he's an old KGB guy, like I said. He better project strength, or they're not going to be intimidated, and they're going to continue to screw with us. And we have to project strength here. And I think we have to make some examples of people when they do something. The guy is right. We have the ability to fry their networks. They got to start thinking about it. I understand I'm worried about, escalating back and forth, but I think that we can tactically say, we don't want to do this. Don't make us do this. But if you do it, we're going to.
Yep. You actually reminded me of this is a potential summer book read for people. It's an old book, but it's Misha Glenny's A McMafia. And it was somebody in the cyber area. He said, he's like, look, you need to understand the basics of like how criminal activity works, and then you just plus this into how cyber criminal activity works. It really isn't.
There's no question. There's no question.
Yeah, and once
you understand, a criminal mind is a criminal mind.
Yeah, right. And then you go, okay, now they don't even have to do the old days where they'd have to drive the BMW to Germany and then drop it off and pick up poor women who would become prostitutes, so then they could go get cocaine. Like they had this whole thing. You're like, now they just stay in their jammies, and they're able to just push buttons. And we also know that the Russians and the Chinese have a deal, whereas as long as all that activity stays outside of Russia and China, they're fine with each other, both groups messing with us. So there's certainly some room for that.
And it does help China advance their long-term goals of, quote unquote, world domination. It sounds like an Austin Powers movie, but it does seem like, it does advance China's goals, and we have to understand that it's a very strategic threat to the American way of life, no doubt.
Yeah, it's a bit frightening. Now, question number 2 here. There is an ongoing debate on whether or not it's okay for ransomware victims to pay ransom to attackers. What do you say to those who feel it is reasonable to pay a ransom absent robust cyber protection from Congress and CISA? Has the government given ransom victims any real alternatives?
That's a great question, and I for one don't think we should be doing it. I never thought we should in hostage situations either, that pay the ransom, because once you start doing that with terrorists, and they're cybers, a lot of people can be considered cyber attackers terrorists. I don't know if they're terrorists in the true sense of the word, but the same type of thing where they're extorting money from you in exchange for an attack that they did on you. I think it's bad to pay it, and obviously the Colonial Pipeline ransom was $5 million. The beef industry ransom was $11 million. They're already ratcheting it up from one incident to another, right? And that's just a matter of a few weeks, right? So if we continue to do this, the sky is the limit on the ransoms that will be demanded. It's not a viable model going forward. And the person is absolutely right. That's why I'm so disappointed with this administration not plussing up spending for CISA and plussing and prioritizing cyber. They talk it, but they're not matching with words, and that's something we need to do as a country. And I blame the previous administration as well. Hell, previous administration didn't even have a cyber director. They didn't want one in the White House. So the bottom line is we have to make sure that that's entrenched, that is elevated, maybe even to a cabinet level position, because they have to understand this is very serious, and we have to approach this in a team end. Look, the FBI with kidnappings is fantastic, right? We have to have that same type of mentality with respect to cyber, where people look at the government and say, my God, they help us all we can. That's great. We're not there yet. We're far away from there. We have to get there.
We kind of have to believe you, because we usually don't find out about those kidnappings till there's some like 20-year thing and somebody writes a book about it, and you find out some heirs, some big family child is, and you're like, wow, that was so scary. The guy had no idea that was going on. Last question.
Right, right.
Let's see. What responsibility does industry have to balance innovations like 5G and quantum computing with cyber concerns? Looking at how quickly the US tech sector has developed, it seems like we've been overlooked some security practices in the name of rapid innovation. How can startups and smaller firms balance cyber risks with growing businesses?
Well, I think having standards, right? And standards and having kind of like this state of the art be the way you go. Like, think about it. When cars are being built, cars are in the innovation in cars, the safety component is considered in the engineering of that car, right? Or in products. And because they do that because a product's liability. They don't want to say, okay, we didn't have state of the art safety in this car. So therefore, if something happens and someone's killed in this car and we didn't have state of the art, we know we're going to get our asses sued, right? We're not having that same mind process with respect to cyber. We're advancing, we're making the technological advances, then afterwards say, oh, geez, there's vulnerabilities here. We've got to get in the mindset of thinking state of the art safety and security components along with state of the art advancements in cyber and quantum computing and everything else. Quantum computing, if China gets it before us, real quantum computing, we got a serious problem. Obviously, they're going to, nothing will be secure. So we have to prioritize as part of our cybersecurity component. Quantum computing has to be a big part of it, but we have to instill in American people, and I go back to what I said earlier, people don't see the threat. They don't understand the threat. Really, to Colonial Pipeline, they didn't understand the threat. Maybe the beef issue because you couldn't get a steak for a couple of days. Until you start seeing that sort of disruption, they just hear about it like this thing that happened, right? We've got to start prioritizing. We've got to systematize and operationalize safety and security standards as we are developing the product, not after we develop them. And we need to encourage industry to do that. I hope that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Congressman, thank you so much for your time on this hopefully beautiful Friday morning up in New York. We're having a bit of rain here in Washington. I also hope that I know one of the things you recently introduced is that you want the Finger Lakes to become a real national treasure. I think they are a national treasure, so I think
Oh,
that makes a
yes.
lot of sense.
I'm
And
10 minutes from one of the most beautiful lakes in the country. Oh my God.
we all need to come visit. Absolutely. And we will be
Anytime.
following
And by
along.
the way,
Yes.
yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but by the way, I'm not going skydiving today. I have a blown out rotator cuff and I've got a sling on. So sorry for the informal look here, but it takes about 20 minutes to get this shirt on. So
I mentioned
that's the best
earlier,
I could do today.
I said, I asked if you, I was like, do you have a gun holster on? He said, no, I had rotator cuff surgery. I was like, oh, I'm sorry for being kind of a jerk about that.
No, not at
I'm,
all. Not at all.
I'm glad you are healing. And we, not only myself, but my colleagues at AEI are watching all the work that you're doing. And we really appreciate you being in Congress. So keep it up and we will stay in touch.
Yeah, I'd love to come back anytime and God bless everybody out there. Spread the word. We got to get this going.
Absolutely. Thank you. All
Take
right, we're
care.
going to
Bye-bye.
transition over to our panel. And as people are coming on, I will start to introduce our panelists. So for our first panelist is Jenny Bedaines. Jenny, please say your last name for me.
Bedaines.
Bedaines, okay. Jenny is the director of strategic projects at Microsoft Cybersecurity and Democracy team, where she specializes in election security and countering the growing threat of nation state actions against our vulnerable democratic institutions globally. Thank God you're there. Her team's effort include increasing the security of campaigns and elections and addressing disinformation campaigns, which we're definitely going to want to talk about. She has more than a decade of experience working in political campaigns and committees to improve the understanding and use of technology. So I think you're gonna add a lot to this conversation. One of our other people who's joining us is Laura Bate. She is a cybersecurity policy fellow at New America and a senior director at the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Laura studied the implementation of big data tools and intelligence environments for her master's degree at Georgetown. So I think that, Laura, you definitely were anticipating today's cybersecurity political environment, and you're hopefully having a great time with the work that you're doing. Laura is also a member of the Mid-Atlantic Affiliate for Women in Cybersecurity, so we look forward to hearing your thoughts on a lot of these things. Con Kitchen, who recently joined me over at the American Enterprise Institute from the Heritage Foundation, is a fellow in foreign defense policy, and he is also a frequent writer about the intersection of technology and national security. Con does have a new Substack called The Kitchen Sink, if anybody wants to sign up. I'm a regular listener. He also has a podcast, so you can listen or read or do both. Sometimes it's good. It's a studying mechanism. You can try them both. While working on Capitol Hill, Klon was assisted in the creation of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. So Laura, thank Klon for having a job. But he also, I like to say, he worked national security for Senator Ben Sass from the great state of Nebraska, being in Nebraska, and I'm very excited that you were there. Andrea Limbago is Vice President for Research and Analysis at Interos. She is a computational social scientist specializing in the intersection of technology, national security, and society. Again, you obviously were predictive in where we were going to need a lot of help, especially today. She leads Intero's research and analyst team that models global supply chain risk with the focus on globalization, cybersecurity, and geopolitics. So that's very timely. She's also a co-program director at the Emerging Tech and Cybersecurity program at the National Security and Institute at George Mason. So I really appreciate you guys all being with us today and following on to that really good conversation that we just had with Congressman Katko. Jenny, let's start with you. Disinformation campaigns are such a challenge in today's society. What are you recommending to your client base, and what do we need to know?
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a huge question. But taking it with bites, disinformation has evolved over time. It's not like there haven't been campaigns like this before social media, right? The idea that especially external actors, nation states are trying to influence others, that has happened as long as time has existed. But we're really obviously at an inflection point now where the reality or what truth is very hard to define. We don't have the same trusted institutions that we used to. A lot of that trust has been broken down. And so I'll focus on the US, as a nation, we're really scrambling, I think, as individuals to know who to trust, what information is accurate. And so this is really an all hands on deck type scenario. We talk a lot about multi-stakeholder engagements around a lot of projects in cybersecurity. I think disinformation is certainly one of those where there's a role for government, both state and local, as well as federal. There's a role for tech industry, and there's a role for civil society. There's really a lot of pieces. You'll hear this a lot, there is no silver bullet to disinformation, right? There's not one piece of software that we can all create, and therefore this is solved. So some of the ways that we've been approaching it as a company have been focused on, first, there are some technology solutions that can be put in place that can be helpful, particularly around what is sort of an emerging threat in disinformation, which is deepfakes, or essentially videos or audio that have been manipulated to make it look like someone says or does something that they didn't do or say. And so we've been working with big collaborations, partnership on AI, as well as some of the other tech companies, on how do you identify what is truth in those videos. Are there ways that you can actually run a video through a system and determine the likelihood that it is real or that it has been manipulated? And ultimately, I think what a lot of us are coming to as a conclusion is it's going to come down to the origin of the media. Is there a way that you can use technology to essentially watermark or stamp a video as to what is authentic and real? So it's less about determining what's fake and more about going back to what's real. So there are some that's just an example of some ways that technology can be a solution. A lot of it is about media literacy as well. How do we inform the public? How do we teach children as well as adults to be thoughtful when consuming information? We partner with a company called NewsGuard that takes sort of the publishing point and just does journalistic criteria measurements against those sites. And then we, through some of our products, will surface sort of a score. And you as an individual have full choice as to whether you want to continue reading that article, go into that website. It just surfaces some additional information for you so that at first glance, you might not realize that a website, it looks like it's local media, but in fact, it's a completely fake site created by an external entity that's pretending to be local media. And it's tools like that can help you make better decisions as a consumer of information without that information being kept from you. You are the one who's empowered to make that choice. So those are some of the solution areas. I know there are a lot of people who are doing great work in this area, but ultimately it comes down to what is truth? How do we trust again? And I think we all have a long way to go on that.
So I would imagine at the beginning of your career, you were looking at a lot of this. When we talk about, it was like in foreign countries, we would worry about it. I mean, there's all these things we do to say, make sure that they're having fair elections. And then all of a sudden it was this very weird feeling in 2020 where a lot of these tools came to our own shore, and we were looking at this at a state and local level. Were you seeing a lot of this in the 2020 election cycle and concerns about disinformation that we were dealing with in that most recent election?
Yeah, I mean, look, frankly, when our program first started up, our focus was on nation state actors because we were reacting in large part to what we witnessed in 2016 in the US. But frankly, this was ramping up all around the globe. And there were some well known actors, many of whom Representative Katko just named, who were actively trying to impact the results of elections, or at least the way people thought and interacted with one another using disinformation campaigns. And a lot of those were coming from abroad. They were coming from other nation states who were looking to interfere. So initial responses were focused on how do you stop these bad actors? And I think a lot of good work was made to identify those problems and help identify what were these obviously coordinated and authentic campaigns and taken down by a lot of our peers in industry. 2020 was a little different, obviously, but I think a lot of the same applications applied as far as the media literacy and people needing to take it in. I'll acknowledge, though, that when things are happening within our own shore, it becomes a lot harder to apply. There was a difference, I think, between the disinformation, meaning the intentional misleading, and the misinformation, meaning individuals who were amplifying information that they believed to be correct. They weren't doing it with ill intent. And then you run into problems when it comes to the content takedowns and whatnot around that. So yeah, 2020 was different, but I think a lot of lessons from 2016 have been carried forward. And we're just going to keep having to anticipate and evolve because I'm sure 2022 and 2024 will show us something that we haven't anticipated quite yet.
Con, looking at the disinformation disruption, this feels like it's part of a master plan. Am I been watching too many movies? There's
No, no. I mean, the idea of disinformation, particularly in the context of a nation like ours, where we have a free and open society, the barriers to entry are so low, and the negative ramifications, at least thus far, have been so minimal that that any entity wanting to shape or just manipulate or frustrate the American population has the capability to do it. Obviously, deepfakes. This is something a lot of us have been talking about for years. It's the technology actually originated in Hollywood when they wanted to be able to do some interesting capabilities. An actor passed away, but they hadn't finished filming, and so they were able to generate tools like that using deepfakes. But we've also seen that you don't need that. Number one, that technology is actually beginning to be democratized and proliferate. It's almost like a service now. You can get apps that will get pretty close to a passable deepfake. But if you'll remember, a year or two ago, someone simply took legitimate video of Speaker Pelosi and just slowed it down. And it made it sound as though her speech was being slurred, and that implied that she was drunk or having some type of mental challenge. Well, those kinds of things are very easy to do. You can't essentially deny people that capability, and those are called cheat fakes. But they can often spread just as quickly as the more kind of technically sophisticated kinds of things. So all that to say, we are entering into a period where there's an erosion of kind of commonly understood truth. And that's unfortunate because it's going to be really difficult to fight. Obviously, consumer awareness and sophistication are going to be areas of focus. But unfortunately, I think what's also going to come along with this is as people become more aware that a lot of the content they see online isn't real or isn't legitimate or isn't trustworthy, I think one of the unavoidable consequences of that is a general erosion of trust and legitimacy. And in a constitutional system like ours, where our key institutions are predicated on legitimacy, on perceptions of legitimacy, we can't help but anticipate some really negative ramifications of that.
I think it's become this very interesting intersection between technology and trust. The New Yorker cartoon about nobody knows you're a dog on the internet. I feel like we're way beyond that, yet we're not. And there's like we need to be doing much more about authentication and making sure that we know who's on systems. We definitely have seen this in this last round of ransomware when you talk to the when they talk to the people, like, how do they get infiltrated? And they're like, they emulated a CEO or somebody in the C-suite of the company. It seems like we should be further along in our ability to at least trust our network systems. And then on top of that, of course, the degradation of trust that we're seeing from the information flow coming off of that is a very tough challenge, I think, for technology to say. And we're seeing this with the edge providers. They don't want to be the people that are sowing the mistrust. They just, we're still trying to figure out how to get on top of that. Andrea and Laura, if you want to jump in on this conversation, you're certainly welcome to. I'd love to have you guys, any thoughts you have on this as well.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it as far as the broader impact and the focus on trust. And so I think that's super important, that it's starting to rise to the top. One interesting thing, like having been in cybersecurity now for a while, disinformation wasn't really something that was thought of as a cybersecurity issue for quite some time, at least within the community itself. And so I think that's what I think has been interesting, is that it really, there was even a little bit of a debate, even back in like 2016, 2017, whether should disinformation be something that cybersecurity experts should really be drawn into? Isn't that just something else that's more of like a media issue or something along those lines? And so that has changed almost overnight, which has been really interesting to watch. And I do think that's one that's very positive, because now we have a whole another group of technologists starting to get on board with addressing this problem. But at the same time, what we're going to need to do is bring in, as a social scientist, bring in the technologists, bring in the social scientists, bring in the media folks. Like, this is a multidisciplinary problem to attack. And we keep working on a lot of these issues in silos. Have your tech experts over here, your people who are experts on, ransomware, vulnerability exploitation, and so forth. We need to have some better cross-pollination in those areas to really start getting there. But the great thing is that it's acknowledged now as an issue. And so, we kind of, our head is out of the sand. And so I think we have a lot of, there's a lot of innovation that can be done in that area that Jeannie talked about as well. And so it's exciting. It's also, it's scary as far as what could go on if left untouched, because it's also, one of those things we talked a lot about how it can influence, with populations, but corporations are also starting to be the target as well of some disinformation campaigns. And so it also can be one of those areas where we're seeing, like these illegitimate PR companies are basically going after other companies. There was some good write-up on the Philippines of this happening, targeting other companies that way. And so it's a whole society problem right now that really needs to be addressed, and it is getting addressed finally. So I think that's the positive news in that area.
Laura, I feel like this is part of your challenge at the commission. Was you were brought a bunch of society and economic challenges, and then said, get into your tech toolbox and tell us how we can fix these. How did that go? I know you guys had the report that come out, but you now are seeing the implementation phase. Do you feel like the problem is better understood, and what technology can do to solve the problem is getting implemented, or how are we doing on this?
To tell you the truth, a lot of the commission's work writ large really extended beyond just technology tools and started to think about what are the incentive structures that set this up, what are the tools government has. And on disinformation, really, we looked at building societal resilience. There are a lot of really hard, really interesting, really important questions around content labeling, content moderation, sort of how you build that trust, how you indicate what is, how you indicate veracity and things like this. The bit that we really wanted to focus on, though, was not so much that, but rather, how do you build a society that is more resilient, that has the tools it needs to think through this? So pulling on the, Andrea, you had mentioned the sort of interdisciplinary nature of this challenge. We were really looking at how do you engage the broad public to think through some of these things, right? Like, how do you build civics education so people understand their democratic institutions and know where to put their trust? How do you build up cyber citizenship, digital literacy? How do you really work with some of these tools? And it's tricky from the perspective of the federal government, because the role of the Department of Education in particular, but the federal government writ large in education is nuanced. So we're thinking about these things, but it's also it's tricky because there are a lot of sort of constraints and factors and things to weigh there. Some of the other things that we thought about are just some of the nuts and bolts of some of our more right now, some of our more brittle systems. So when we were writing our report, it was published in spring 2020. So we were staring down the barrel of the election. And so we were also looking at things like incorporating someone on the Election Assistance Commission to think about cybersecurity and things like that. So also thinking through what are these critical systems, where are they brittle, and how can you address that so that they're not quite so subject to disinformation.
Jenny, it sounds like you have the government usually a couple steps behind things that you probably are already solved for. Are there any things that you can share that you've seen as a solution set that works with concerns about societal resilience?
Around societal resilience? Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we're necessarily out in front of government. I think it just sort of depends on the topic and what the incentives are, right? I mean, I've, for what it's worth, I've been incredibly impressed with how CISA has taken on these issues very quickly. The way they quickly pulled together their disinformation site around the election, and that they had the rumor control site up and running. You know, that was an example where, sure, there were companies, industry, Microsoft, others could have done that kind of function, but they were the appropriate landing place for that. There was sort of a trust in that. They were working closely with state and local governments when they built out that rumor control site. That's an area where they were the appropriate entity to do that, and they did it very well, and they did it very quickly. I think before others in industry really had gotten their mind around, should we be posting that kind of site, and are we a trusted source for that? So I understand the indication, because often industry is out ahead on technology and other issues, but there are areas where I've seen recent innovation in the government that I've actually been quite impressed by. CISA being certainly on these issues a leader on that. And general issues of societal resilience that's sort of a bigger question that maybe we can get at as we keep going through the conversation. But that's one example where I think government's actually done quite a good job.
Glad to hear that. Colin, we talking about incentives or potentially disincentives. You had a piece on Monday about the idea that, the DOJ treating ransomware like terrorism. So what is the difference that DOJ is now implementing that may make a difference on how we handle not only ransomware, but a lot of cyber attacks?
So it's largely a bureaucratic response, but that doesn't mean that it's not important and impactful. Essentially, what DOJ did is it made a decision that internally it was going to begin operating and coordinating ransomware investigations in the same way that they do terrorism investigations, which essentially means a lot more internal information sharing and the DOJ maintaining kind of a strategic oversight of all of those various investigations, and understand they're actually better understood as part of one coherent challenge. So in the same way that they would think about terrorism as not a series of one-off investigations, but that they have a common root that needs to be considered comprehensively, that's what DOJ is doing with ransomware. Now, let me just kind of spit a couple of metrics that underscore something that the congressman was saying in terms of the scale of this and why DOJ is making that response. So in 2020, nearly 2,400 US government, healthcare, and school networks were shut down by ransomware. The average downtime of one of those attacks was 21 days, but the average recovery time, so the time that it took for them to actually get back up and running the way they were prior to the attack, was 287 days. $350 million was paid in the United States in ransomware payments in 2020. That's a 311% increase over the year prior. And then the average payment of one of those payments was $312,493. Again, a 171% increase over 2019. So when we say that the ransomware concerns are growing and that they're significant, that is not hyperbole. And the final point that I make that I do think the congressman was also making was this: there is no scenario where the United States is able to secure itself from in terms of its cyber interests, absent a deep integration of the private sector at the policy and strategy level. So we are all over the same barrel, and I think both industry and government are recognizing that. And we used to give each other the Heisman because we only made each other's lives more difficult. But now the pain point has become sufficiently acute to where we are meaningfully trying to find new ways to work together going forward.
Yeah, I think, of your days back in the Senate or, things that you've done previous to that, where you would bring this, not necessarily in the public forum that we just saw with the Colonial Pipeline CEO this past week, but, you're like, you bring a guy in and it's like, he's been lawyered up to not tell you anything because he doesn't want any liability. And you're like, but you know how they did it, and we don't want it to happen again. Like, and the incentive to be like, can we please learn from this process and figure out how to manage that? And then in the movie script, had the version of this in my head, I'm like, and then there's an insurance agent saying, not sure we're going to, what's the economic value of the fact that you just shut down the entire water system or the electrical system? And then, where are we going to go on that? And then is there any like friction point that the government might come in a little bit on this? So I feel like, a lot of stuff's gone on behind closed doors, and hopefully it's had a net positive effects, a little bit like he was talking about when you kidnap somebody. But I also think that we need to have this conversation out loud, and we're getting better at it maybe, but it's certainly frightening. The capabilities of what you can shut down. I think of your example, like Baltimore, because it's local to us here in Washington. We just watched them have this like ransomware attack, and the entire city of Baltimore was kind of shut down, and it was like kind of like everybody's like, at what point does it matter? And they weren't able to do so many functions, and it wasn't until they hit a certain function level of dysfunction they're like, okay, we need to pay these guys. It's really, really a tough situation. I want to move on to supply chain management because it's such a big issue, both at a macro and a micro level, and national security as well as individuals. So, Andrea, can you just give us a little background on what you're working at over in Tews? I think it's fascinating the way you're mapping these supply chains.
Yeah, no, and absolutely. And supply chains are so interconnected with cybersecurity. Like at least the way I look at it increasingly, it's really hard to disconnect the two. Everything is so hyper-connected, both economically and digitally. And so, in order to to really figure out what some of your risks are in the cyber realm, you also need to know what your risks are across your supply chain, because we've seen over and over a rise in third-party attacks. And so it used to be the adage that you could you lock down your perimeter, you're good to go. We moved on in cybersecurity to the perimeter is dead, and that was more so focused on the cloud. And really, what we need to focus on is even expanding it more so to who are your suppliers, who are your partners, who else has access to your data. And the core problem with that is that for a lot of companies, they know who their first tier of their supply, they know who their initial suppliers are. They don't know who their second tier, third tier, and so forth are. And over the last several decades, because of hyper specialization of components, you have to go down and start mapping to those other tiers to actually know where some of your risks might be. And that's really been a relatively new way of thinking about it. Some of the more forward-leaning companies have been looking at this for a while, but for the most part, again, COVID was a wake-up call in so many different areas, and it's been awful in so many areas. When it comes to supply chain, it was one of those things that pushed supply chain from sort of an esoteric niche discussion that not many people really cared about to headline news now. And so when we start seeing sort of the intersection as well with like ransomware and then in meatpacking coming in, so that's we keep seeing more and more of this intersection between the two. And so it's one of those things that we need to start figuring out and gaining that visibility of where's your data going, who has access to it, but then also looking at that, who are your partners, what software are they using? Because like again, SolarWinds, great example. Not everyone, even if you didn't have SolarWinds, you still might have been drawn into that due to your more extended network. And so it does become very complicated, but that's really what we're looking at is mapping and providing some of that mapping and that visibility so companies can start seeing where their risks might be. Maybe not right now, but one, if an event does happen, know how it may affect you before it actually does affect you. But then two, starting to look at and map out where some of those vulnerabilities might be in it. Part of it is the software, part of it's the physical component, and then part of it also gets into this range of rules and regulations that are starting to pop up and have been popping up really for a while across the globe, the splintering of the internet, where in certain areas, if you're really highly dependent on a company in a country that requires turning over data to that government, if asked, that becomes yet another risk for your across your supply chain. So it's only getting more complex is the unfortunate thing, but trying to help simplify that by providing that visibility and surfacing how these cybersecurity and interconnected components add to that risk is really where we're focused.
I recently did an interview with Dr. Alan Friedman, by the way. Sorry for not calling you Doctor, Andrea, to be a little more informal, on his software bill of materials and the importance of having a level of transparency in software because of exactly the supply chain. Like you don't realize you're building on other people's work. And, it's interesting. We saw, a big move 10 years ago in Silicon Valley or in the tech industry was to containers. And one of the things that people liked about that was that you actually knew what you were getting, and it was same all the time, or hopefully all the time. And when you work in technology, it's always the anomaly you're looking for. And what seems fascinating to me for you guys is like you are perpetually looking for the anomaly to be like, where's the hiccup, and then how long is the hiccup going to either be inconvenient, a regulatory issue, or, and to take it to a physical thing that makes it easier. Is I always think about like airlines. I'm a big United flyer, and it's like, okay, not enough napkins on the carts. That's inconvenient. But what point are you in a regulatory point, or you're like, no, that plane cannot fly, and then what is it that's the missing part, which I'm always happy they figure out the missing part while I'm on the ground. And then when they don't actually like have it somewhere in the local warehouse, I'm like, and so hopefully that's something that you are teaching a lot of these, corporations and entities. But I think that the intermezzo now in between the physical, the software and the system that gets you going there, we definitely, especially after the situation with the container ship in the Straits this past year, realized that as much as just-in-time delivery was really cool, may need an extra day in that system. So I really look forward to seeing the stuff that you're working on. Other thoughts on supply chain?
I think that nailed it. I think the other aspect, talking about like the how it starts impacting your life, what the representative was talking about as far as the chips, right? And that's where we're starting to see it as well. And that's where you get the concentration risks that start popping up. But even just in the last day or two, we're hearing the more of some of the ports, especially in China, I think in Taiwan, are having some COVID outbreaks. So that as well is impacting actually the broader chip supply chain. So there's all these different ways that the supply chain gets impacted. That does end up linking back to cybersecurity, either that one via some of the hardware. So it's really, it's only growing in prominence, to your point. And the software bill of materials, the great thing about that, there are some executive orders that are finally prioritizing this aspect of it. And so that's just something to throw out there that, again, we haven't had a ton of movement in this area, but even across both administrations, there were several executive orders prioritizing either from the health and medical supply chain, pharmaceuticals, to semiconductor and chip manufacturing, and now new ones coming out as well, including like electric batteries and so forth. So we are starting to see some legislation moving at the executive order level. It'll be great to start getting some of the congressional legislation going through, because I think all of that really does matter. And to the point of the representative made as far as getting some of those standards in there, for companies that are looking at building out their supply chain or looking at either alternative suppliers and so forth, if we can have some of those standards as far as, okay, we know this company has, they're certified by X, Y, and Z, and so forth. We know that for sure. This other company is not. That becomes a competitive advantage as well. And so it gets back to the incentives. If we can create these standards as a way of competitive advantage, the market can help shift it towards better security as well.
Very early in my career, I went and toured FedEx when I worked for the Secretary of Transportation. They showed us how much snow removal equipment they had in Memphis. It seemed crazy. But they were like, that one day that we can't move things, our reputation is out the window. So we have all this equipment here. And as somebody who's a resident of DC, they still haven't learned that here. Fascinating.
No, they're not at all.
Right. Talk about executive orders, Laura. I feel like all of a sudden people have had a rush to read your report. If it was the old school days, Barnes and Noble would be like running out of the Solarium Commission report, because you're now you're getting listed in all kinds of things. How do you feel about the uptake? Are you seeing a lot of progress and a lot of the work that you guys have done in the past couple of years actually coming to fruition?
Well, yeah. And a lot of that really, so first off, I'll say, the hard copy is an interesting question in terms of the commission's report. We have a lot of hard copies. They are not distributed. It turns out they're sitting in boxes in our office because of the pandemic. So it is an interesting challenge in speaking of supply chain. But yeah, we are seeing uptake in a lot of these things. And, an enormous amount of that is hats off and full credit to Congress, who's really been taking the bull by the horns here. Representative Katko in particular has been a fantastic champion for cybersecurity throughout the course of the commission's work. So we're very grateful for that, for all of our congressional commissioners, for taking these ideas and turning them, instead of just a stack of reports sitting in the back of our office, turning it into some actual real product moving forward. On top of just the report itself, I would also say that we did a white paper on ICT supply chain security, and a number of those ideas, they've had less time to work towards implementation. So as we look at the current legislative cycle, there's a lot of optimism about how we can work with some of that. But I think that there's a lot that we've done. As you say, the recent executive orders, we're starting to see progress on that. There's quite a bit in Endless Frontiers, now U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. But I think that we can also be looking at how we engage with our allies and partners. And I think a lot of that speaks to cyber diplomacy. The Cyber Diplomacy Act is moving right now and could have a lot of bearing on making us more effective in thinking through how we as an international community can put critical supply chain elements in trusted countries. It doesn't necessarily all need to be in the US. There are plenty of places that really would work or that have a comparative advantage, and we should be utilizing that. We also need to be thinking about how we invest internationally. So, investment finance corporations, things like that, these sort of international arms that the US has to further development, whether it's a function of investment or just aid. We need to be thinking about strategically, where are the countries that we trust, where are our partners and allies, and how can we be advancing the things that are critical to us and critical to all of us, the community of nations that agree that we want a free, open, interoperable, secure internet. How can that whole community of nations be structuring things to encourage a secure supply chain? That was a lot. The answer to your question is yes, we're seeing progress. Thanks, Congress.
And I forgot that your commission report came out the week that COVID was announced. That was
a whole thing.
I think you were the last group that actually were in a Senate building as a group. And after that, they shut the door right behind you.
Yes,
I'm sure we can help you get those reports out if they're fun to read. I'm pretty happy to read it on my computer. But Jenny and Klon, I know, talking about kind of collaborative efforts and commissions, you guys are working on some things on the international perspective on kind of how should we be thinking about these issues, not only from a collective group, but national security. We have lots of things going on in this space that are looking for answers. Where are you guys working on answers?
Well, one thing I'll say is first echoing what Laura said about the action in Congress as well as in the administration with the executive orders. It's really gratifying to see the good work that the commission has done start to take shape in pieces, starting with NDAA and working its way through current bills. And that's just really encouraging. It's frankly, the devil will be in the details, especially with the EO, to see how those general concepts are actually put into effect. And we're excited to see how that comes together and see what role we can play in helping with that. But the other area to consider, to your point, Shane, is sort of the international environment. And so one thing that we're also really focused on and thinking a lot about is deterrence of these attacks in the first place, and how do sort of the international norms play into that? How do we get to the root of the problem and essentially not just shame, but also have consequences built in when nation states either are the ones who are advancing these attacks, which we've seen occur and be attributed by both the government as well as private sector in recent past, but also when they allow it to happen within borders, to the points that have been made earlier. Just because the nation state itself is maybe not responsible for a particular attack, it's sort of hard to believe that they haven't given some kind of tacit approval for that in many cases. And so there's a lot of activity happening within the UN and in other environments where international bodies, like-minded democracies and others are coming together and trying to identify the red lines in this area. What kind of norms can we establish? Not because we expect that these nations will necessarily follow it just because it's a norm, but in part because by establishing that and creating that, you now as responders, our country as well as like-minded countries, can actually respond once that line has been crossed, if we've all sort of agreed to a norm that has been set. And so I think that is what we will hopefully see more of. I'm really encouraged by President Biden's call to have sort of a gathering, a summit of democracies, where I understand cybersecurity is going to be on the agenda in one way or another. And really look forward to seeing how that conversation moves forward, because in the end, yes, we should all be doing best practices and protecting ourselves. And there's a lot of great work to do on prosecuting and going after bad actors after they've done things. But how do we ultimately get to the root of some of these problems? And I think really, if we tackle the international norms side of things, we can really make some progress.
I'm going to show my agency. I have a Monty Python skit going in my head. I'm like, are you a democracy? Questionable. Sweden, well, social democracy. Yeah, you're still a democracy. We're worried about some of those other pay for things. But anyway, Klon, further thoughts on that? Not on Monty Python, but on the cooperation.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, I think that there is now broad international agreement on a fundamental truth, and that is that defending nations means defending networks, and defending networks means defending supply chains. Right? That is now an undergirding truth to how most, certainly Western nations and China, are thinking about geopolitical engagement and technology's role as a variable in kind of international calculus. For the United States, one of the things that we are doing, and this is something that Jenny certainly hit on, is we are beginning to think about how we can develop global alliances that are specifically aimed at fostering trusted technological development and deployment, particularly with Western democracies. This is something that was talked about in the previous administration, and is something that's been identified as a priority under the current administration. So there's a host of different proposals in terms of what that might look like, but the underlying reality is the awareness that even if the United States were somehow able to isolate itself and reshore everything and independently insulate itself from some of these systemic risks, that actually wouldn't serve our national security and geopolitical interest well, because if our key partners and allies ultimately get consumed by, for example, Chinese expansion, well, that doesn't work, because you have to have things like interoperability with NATO partners. And so I think what you're going to see is you're going to see continued deliberate diplomatic engagement on issues of technology and mutually beneficiary relationships and partnerships, so that we foster technological development within each other. We create these virtuous networks within trusted nations for the development of technologies, but then also building resilience in supply chains. And I'm guardedly optimistic. As a national security guy, I spent 15 years in the U.S. intelligence community, so I don't often get to be the optimistic guy. But on this, I think that we have finally gotten to the point. We don't quite know how we're going to do it, but I'm confident we're going to work that part out. What I'm pleased by is a very common view now that something has to be done. And one of the key conclusions that has eluded us, but I think is now set in, is a fundamental need to reprioritize and relook at Western posture toward economic and technological trade with China. I think that picture is now commonly held. We're fleshing out the details, and I think that puts us in a much better position for long-term security going forward.
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative, we were focused on this a lot in the last couple of years. Sorry, one of my colleagues over at AI is on the idea of how it has become a digital Belt and Road. And I don't think, a lot of people are not focused on that, who aren't looking at this from an international perspective. And absolutely the supply chain entity to that, the Chinese showing up, putting an entire network in your government, giving you a low level, or if a loan at all, and then all of a sudden you're locked into their technology and everything going forward. For those of us who were young enough or old enough to understand when we were young, that it was when the Russians were receding and the United States was very quick to come into Eastern Europe and say, we want to put our technology forward because we know whoever puts the next then telecommunication system in is going to win a lot of the next rounds of information thought process within these countries. And I'm still very concerned that Chinese are beating us on price. Their technology is often as equal to ours. A lot of intellectual property concerns around that. But I guess I'm doing my best to avoid saying Huawei. I don't know why. The Huawei challenge, ZTE, they have very, very good equipment. People want to say, it's because you think it's inferior, and you're like, no, it's because of why it's there. And I think we have, for a while, been maybe polite about avoiding these conversations. And now I think that they're very front and center as to what we're doing. And then also, going back to disinformation, not, always people, you get the question on a lot of the policy areas that we're in is like, well, what's your proof point? And my proof point is I have a long history of not trusting them. And that sometimes isn't enough for some people, but a lot of people, they start to get that. So I think that hopefully that will be a continued area that we will not only test in the policy arena, but in the global, area. And, UN, always a challenge, right? They just their ability to get people in from the Chinese entities to their working groups, and especially their technical working groups, is a concern that a lot of us on the geeky side have had a long-term concern about, but we haven't had the politicians understanding it, and I think we're getting there. So I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing in that space.
Shane, can I just foot stomp one thing on that proof point notion? Two things there. One, I always make it a point to make a distinction between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist government, because it's not as though a Chinese company couldn't operate responsibly. It's that the Chinese Communist Party will not allow them to. And the way we know that is because the Chinese Communist Party has been kind enough to put their laws into English because they expect American companies to comply with them when they operate in China. So we know what the digital requirements and data sharing information requirements are, and we can read that, and it's not difficult. So when I talk to my skeptical friends, and I understand that national security has been used in the past as a specious justification for some policies, but when I speak to my skeptical friends, I try to remind them that you don't have to conclude that every Chinese company is malevolent, but they are compliant. And if they're not compliant with Chinese law, then they will not be in business very long. And so there's a natural logic chain that we just have to accept, and we don't have to like it. But if we're going to be serious about securing ourselves, we have to just recognize that reality.
I think that's a very good point.
And actually, just to hop on top of that just a little bit, as well as we've been talking about incentives a lot during this, which is great. I love it. We were finally thinking about how to change behavior by incentives. Huawei and ZTE are the ones that always come to mind, but there's been something like over 350 different companies that the Commerce has added to their restrictions list. And so that's where you're getting some incentives for those who don't believe that there might be these risks. The government is stepping in and basically saying, here are the list of the companies that you cannot have various kinds of economic relationships or capital flow relationships with. And that's become something that is across government, from Pentagon putting out lists that then have now been integrated into Treasury. You work with some of the State Department, but Commerce for sure, some of the NDAAs as far as Section 889. I mean, it's popping up across the government that is impacting on the private sector side who they can interact with and what some of those costs will be. So it really, the government is, and again, this is something that's been cross administrations, impacting the incentive structure in a wide range to try and get at those trusted networks. So it's sort of the, helping push towards some of the trusted network component that to Con's point, it's exciting to see where that might go with that.
I'm going to actually go to some of the questions I have in our Q&A here because it leads on to that. So we have a question about, with the surge in ransomware incidents, would it make sense to push for a digital currency like what China's doing? And there's an assumption in that question that we would understand everybody who's on the digital ledger for the currency. Thoughts on that? No one wants to tackle cryptocurrency.
There's a lot to be said for know your customer. I think that there's a lot to be said for making sure that we're engaging with the private sector. That I don't think you necessarily need to be talking about regulation, but know your customer becomes a very important element of this, building relationships with the private sector. Part of building the trust that helps us get there. Short answer to a complex question, but
no, I actually think you take that into many areas. I have had a long-term relationship with a group that was doing child online safety originally. It's iSafe out of California, and they have pivoted to doing a version of Know Your Customer, but it's making sure that we know who the parents and the children are and who we're actually letting into systems. It's been interesting as we've gone to either a hybrid or a lot of online learning that we don't actually validate that it's just kids online, right? So there's all these tiering elements where God love the people who created the internet. I love the godfathers of all, that created HTTPS, and even Vint Cerf will say, sorry, I wasn't thinking more about security at the time. But we have kind of run through the test of the trust gambit. And now we need to know who we're dealing with, especially when it comes to, not only the very important measures of, government entities, but even, it goes down to the level of understanding that who our kids are dealing with in a school entity. So know your customer is vitally important.
One thing I'd add, sort of more generally on the ransomware front, I just recently participated in the ransomware task force, which came out right before Colonial Pipeline. And frankly, there was a lot in the report, but the main gist of it was everyone should be paying attention to this. And then Colonial happened. And so it was, sort of fortuitous. But we had different sections of the report where we were tackling different aspects of ransomware. And one was around disruption. There's deterrence and there's, all of the response, things you would expect. But on that section on disruption, there was a lot. It's a great report. If you all want to look it up, it was put out by the Institute for Security and Technology, the Ransomware Task Force report. But there was a lot that tackled cryptocurrencies and the role that they play in ransomware. And what we just saw happen where the FBI was able to claw back a little bit of the Colonial funds, not to mention just sort of the kind of question that was just asked. For those who care about cryptocurrency and invest in it, and that's an area where they are anticipating a bright future, there needs to be some action by that community themselves to try and get these bad actors out. And there are ways, and a lot of it's detailed in the report and elsewhere, but it's just sort of if you care about this community, you should recognize how it's being misused and how the criminal element is really taking over. And it will lead to solutions like what was suggested in this question if that community doesn't start to regulate itself a little bit.
I also love that there was a teachable moment about the market situation of crypto in the recovery of the ransomware. And people are like, why didn't they get it all? I'm like, well, they got a little more than they thought they, the market went down. And, those who have been following GameStop have a better idea of what's going on there. But yes, it's a definite challenge. All right, we have another question. Let's see. Should we be trying to consolidate government cyber operations under CISA or prioritizing interagency cooperation? Are both possible, or is cyber too complex and important to delegate to multiple agencies? Open question.
Can I jump in on part of that one? I think, following on the heels of yesterday's confirmation hearing for the National Cyber Director, I think that there is very, very obvious need for greater coordination. That's not necessarily the same thing as consolidation. And to Representative Katko's point earlier today, this administration, or at least the budget that we saw come out, the president's budget request doesn't have significant increases for CISA, about $110 million, which works out to be something like 5 or 6%. So I think that there's CISA's, you can grow it. There's a lot to be done there to grow it. Now is not the moment to consolidate everything under CISA. Now is the moment to be thinking about how we coordinate across the interagency, how we strengthen all of these parts, how we strengthen CISA so it can do its part, how we strengthen the whole of the interagency, and get everybody working on the same page, right? The metaphor that I keep hearing is a really good one. The National Cyber Director ends up being the quarterback, the director of CISA, ends up being the coach, whereas the director of CISA ends up being the quarterback. You can tell I don't football very often. But, the idea is that it's not a question of consolidation, it's a question of coordination. Everybody has their part to play. It's important that we resource enable them to do so properly. But we need greater coordination to get there.
Laura, the most important thing to know when it comes to football analogies is the ability to do an audible. You can just call it, right? So stick with that. But I do think the fact that we haven't had a baseline of operation within our departments and agencies for cybersecurity is probably shocking, if not the most frightening thing, that we just couldn't get everybody to understand because of the way that that we were designed, and they all have different levels of entry. And for a long time, that was like this is really vital information, so let's focus on this. And we kind of back channeled on that. But I think after OPM and what we saw happen around 2016, where there was the majority of the government who's, the human resources side of the government realized they just became very vulnerable and became very interested in what was going on with this information. So I realize we've been solving this kind of in a backwards fashion, but I think that a lot of the work you guys are doing in the report is hopefully pushing us forward, and we're working on horizon issues and not just backfilling on those things. Any other thoughts about the?
I wonder if I can just follow up on that one to give credit where credit is due after I make points about CISA's lack of funding. To your point about increasing the security of federal networks writ large, to give credit where credit is due, the president's budget request does increase by about 14% funding for federal civilian cybersecurity. So, I think we have learned the lesson this year that we need to be securing and that we need to be coming up with good security across the whole of the interagency. The question is where we go from there, how we work beyond that.
I call it, it's a little bit of the Medicare situation in healthcare, where once you put it into Medicare, then the rest of the insurance industry goes, well, it's just easier to follow that. So, once you put it within the government, and especially when it comes to procurement and the vendor responsibility through, the various agencies and GSA, it becomes more of a natural baseline, I think. So I hope we're seeing that is the case. Colonial, like you were nodding. Any thoughts on that?
I was nodding because there's been lots of good insights shared. The only thing I'll add to it is simply that President Biden's recent executive order put out a week and a half ago or so, it does exactly that, or intends to do exactly that, in that it's trying to clean out the government's house and organize things like information sharing within the government and rapid response and normalizing. They're even trying to build playbooks for responding and that kind of thing. Some of it's going to be good, some of it's going to be bad. None of it is shocking. It's the kinds of lessons learned that those of us who've been paying attention to this for a while, aren't surprised by. But if the government is able to right itself and organize itself as this EO lays out, it will have very positive downstream effects. And in the same way that you were mentioning in terms of Medicare, much of industry will look at that baseline off of that because it's how they're going to be able to do business with government. And then there's already a host of private sector actors who are aligning their offerings to help government get squared away along these new regulations and say, like, look, there's real money there. We can help you get there. And so there's the right, in my view, kind of private sector economic incentive for aligning courses of effort between industry and government.
Great. All right, another question from the audience here. What should be next on Congress's cyber agenda if something concrete could hypothetically be passed and implemented tomorrow? What should it be? So if you get them wave a magic wand and they're actually going to pass something, which I kind of feel like is happening with the semiconductor, that just never happens. Let's just keep it going. So putting that one aside. Wish list.
I mean, we literally keep lists, but I want to give everybody else a chance to respond to that one.
You have binders full of information of things that you could just push forward, right?
Well, yeah, I know, sitting right next to the stacks full of reports. So I'll jump in on this one and I'll make it quick because I do want to hear from everybody else as well. A couple of the things that we have, so some of it's already on the floor. Some of the commission's work is in the bill that you were discussing earlier, the USICA bill. The Cyber Diplomacy Act is also making its way through. So, we would like to see those continue to make their way through. We would like to see those continue. And it is really exciting to be able to see things like this pass freestanding, not have to wait for the NDAA. Beyond that, a couple of our priorities really touch on some of this incentive structure for the private sector, information sharing engagement that we were talking about earlier. Systemically important critical infrastructure was one of the commission's proposals that's very, very high on our priority list. I apologize for the acronym. I blame it on my coworkers. Systemically important critical infrastructure, SICI, is a structure by which we determine what the most critical of the critical of critical infrastructure would be. So not just what is critical to the American way of life, but what is systemically critical for keeping all of that up and running. And the idea is we take a look at all of this and set up new incentive structures, set up a new relationship with the owners and operators of that critical infrastructure, such that there are some benefits to being classified as a SICI entity, and there are some burdens to it. The benefits are things like greater information sharing, a certain degree of liability protection in inappropriate cases, limitations and, follow the rules sort of exemptions on it. But then the burdens of that is that these private sector entities would be held to a higher cybersecurity standard. We need to know that they are meeting that baseline threshold that we've been talking about. And they would need to be able to confirm that. They would need to be able to show us that they are doing so. So I think that, you can shape some of those relationships. The other thing that I would flag is we're looking at information sharing through a joint collaborative environment. This would be a sort of an environment by which the interagency can share what is now separate data sets on cybersecurity threats. so the idea is to break down some of the technological and process barriers that are currently inhibiting the spread of that information, and enable faster detection for threats from cyber actors like China. We start with the interagency, then we grow to incorporate the private sector in this. So a couple of our priorities, but I'll hand it over to the others.
That makes a lot of sense. So the one thing I want to make sure everybody heard there is if you run out of ideas, Laura has lists.
Lists and lists.
Anybody who's watching who's like, my boss is looking for some ideas, here's your girl. She's got it. Other comments on this?
I'm also going to add, there's already been some good movement, both in proposed budgets as well as some legislation around strengthening state and local government infrastructure. Improving it for usability purposes is incredibly important in and of itself, but also from a cybersecurity and protection standpoint, there's really kind of an asymmetric threat when you look at these small local governments who are running their own infrastructure and trying to protect themselves versus when they're being attacked by a nation state, for example. Of course, my mind, given the work I do, goes to elections, and considering the fact that we know and empower our state and local officials to run elections. It's their job, it's their duty. At the same time, they are being faced with, in some cases, nation state level attacks. And that's just not, that's not a fair shake. They do need some support, whether that support is through improved standards, which the EAC has recently put forward and are following through on, as well as additional funding. And again, not just for election, state and local government infrastructure generally, but with the focus in my mind on making sure that our election systems have the resiliency that they need to face some of these attacks. As much as we look back on what happened in 2020, I encourage everyone to not forget what we saw in 2016 and to not assume that just because we didn't see a lot of activity from nation states against elections in this last cycle, that means it's done. That could always come back. And so there's really a need there for strengthened cybersecurity best practices. And a lot of that does really come through resources.
Guys, we are at time. I just want to thank you for such a great conversation. Everybody's bios who were engaged in this discussion today are on the AEI website. I highly encourage that you follow all of these wonderful people who are crazy smart on this topic. They're part of my brain trust of, what to be thinking about when and where, and hopefully we're solving problems. So thank you for spending your Friday morning with us. And thank you to all those who took the time to learn more about cybersecurity this morning. So I appreciate your time and energy towards this, and let's just hope that we all have great success going forward in 2021.